George Washington's effort to hold off the British invasion of New York could not have gone worse. Luckily, the Continental Army avoided complete annihilation by slipping across the Long Island Sound. Under cover of darkness, the battle itself was a humiliating defeat for Washington, but the loss also revealed an insight that was key to the ultimate American success. The Continental Army could afford to lose battles, but if it remained an army in being, the British couldn't declare victory. Washington rightly surmised that, as long as the enemy couldn't win the war, they would eventually lose. Defeat can be an integral instrument of victory. War is a competition between thinking, scheming, determined adversaries. Gaining a decisive advantage over the enemy is the ultimate high ground. Sometimes this critical competitive edge comes from losing battles when the loss sparks the actions that lead to winning. For much of the 19th and 20th century, the Western way of war was battle-centric. Blame Waterloo 1815, the climatic one-shot campaign that ended Napoleon's run as the military master of Europe. Clausewitz and Jomini, the two top commentators on Napoleonic warfare, went through a lot of ink describing the role of battle in diminishing the enemy's capacity to wage war. Meanwhile, Cressy's book on decisive battles of the Western world propelled combat into the center of Victorian pop culture. An addictive attention to battle endured well into the next century, even with the advent of push-button nuclear warfare and the resurgence of messy, shadowy insurgencies like Vietnam. The rise of Hollywood over the course of the 20th century helped secure battles' place high on the pedestal of pop culture. Battles have a strong narrative content focused in time, place, and action. For cinema, they made the best kind of war stories. The Longest Day, an epic retelling of the Normandy invasion, proved a predictable hit with audiences. Combat was not just for movies. Battle remained serious business for modern warriors. After Vietnam, the Pentagon talked about winning America's next first battle that was supplanted by airland battle. John Keegan's book The Face of Battle proved extremely influential with the U.S. military as the armed forces worked their way out of the funk of the post-Vietnam era. U.S. military training focused like a laser on fighting battles. Army brigades sparred in the desert at the National Training Center. The Air Force had Red Flag, the Marines had 29 Palms, the Navy had its war games. That was then. Today, battles seem to have lost their luster. Places like Fallujah are just exotic-sounding names that strike a vague chord with most Americans. Ambivalence over battle stems from the queasy feeling that combat just doesn't resolve anything anymore. Notions of conflict are more muddled now, with new terms like hybrid warfare, cyber conflict, and human, energy and climate security. While the last century's fixation with battle might have been overly obsessive, the post-Cold War dismissal of the banality of battle is equally unhealthy. When enemies resort to armed conflict, battles can happen. It makes little sense to ignore the importance of combat. Let's keep the study of battle. On the other hand, remember, battle is just one component of war. Like an inning is just one part of a baseball game, the outcome of combat has relevance only in the context of the larger conflict. All battles are worth reflection. While students of battle tend to focus on what it takes to win a fight, it's just as important to determine what can be learned from getting whipped. Here are 5 battles from American history where losing wound up putting the nation on the path to victory. 5. The Battle of Long Island. George Washington's effort to hold off the British invasion of New York could not have gone worse. Luckily, the Continental Army avoided complete annihilation by slipping across the Long Island Sound. Under cover of darkness, the battle itself was a humiliating defeat for Washington, but the loss also revealed an insight that was key to the ultimate American success. The Continental Army could afford to lose battles, but if it remained an army in being, the British couldn't declare victory. Washington rightly surmised that, as long as the enemy couldn't win the war, they would eventually lose. 4. Little Big Horn. Custer had better days when his small detachment of the 7th Cavalry was wiped out on the Montana plains. There were big repercussions after the Civil War. The lion's share of the military budget went into the Army's coastal fortifications. The Army ground forces were mostly a constabulary, second-hand lot strewn across the southern and western states. Custer's last stand was a bit of a wake-up call. Congress began to supply better arms and equipment. The Army started on the long march to becoming a Modern land power D-Day was more than a half-century in the future, but the journey from the Spanish-American War to World War I to World War II started out west. 3. Kasserine Pass.